Welcome to Natural Selection Part 2. In this particular section, we are going to be talking a little bit more about natural selection and how it works, and then we'll take a look at the different types of natural selection and then also some artificial selection. So you're probably wondering, why is there a bell curve here? We're not talking about statistics or anything like that. We're talking about genetics and natural selection, right? Well, anytime you talk about natural selection or genetics, you are actually talking about statistics. Every characteristic of every living thing, when measured, will fall along a bell curve, a normal curve, where when you have between 1 and 2 standard, but plus 1 minus standard deviation, you're going to have about 68% of all of the organisms, plus minus 2 standard deviations, and you've got 95% of all of that, of all the measurements in that particular category, and plus minus 3 standard deviations from the mean, and you're going to have almost 100% of all of the organisms. So that's why this is here. If we were looking at height of humans, you're going to have the mean height of all humans plus minus 1 standard deviation. You're going to have 68% of humans are going to be plus minus 1 standard deviation of the mean height, plus minus 2 standard deviations, and you're going to have 95% of all humans that we're going to fit within that height. You're still going to have this 0.14% way up here that's greater than 3 standard deviations above the mean height, and you're going to have about 0.14% of the population that is minus 3 standard deviations from the mean height. And that's just one example. So 3 types of natural selection, and how does that work together with the normal curve here? We have something called directional selection. Directional selection means that one extreme or the other is being selected for. So let's say that we're talking about height. If, for instance, height in humans were something that would be selected for, if we were to take a look at, say that only those individuals that were plus 2 standard deviations above the mean were selected for. Okay, they're the only ones who are going to get to mate. So what's going to happen is this whole curve is going to be moving to the right. It's going to be moving to the upper extreme. There will still be a mean, but that mean will be shifted to the right. And then all of the other points in here will all be shifted to the right. You'll still have the standard curve, but it will be shifted to the upper extreme because that's being selected for. Same thing if we selected for only humans that were minus 2 standard deviations below the mean height, then that's going to take the whole human population's height and shift it to the left towards that extreme. So directional selection means that only one or the other extreme is selected for. Disruptive selection. Disruptive selection happens if both means are selected for. Only those people who are minus 2 standard deviations below the mean or plus 2 standard deviations above the mean are going to get to reproduce. What that's going to do is that's going to end up taking this curve and it's going to hollow out the middle, and so you're going to end up with a bimodal or a 2 curve. So instead of 1 curve, you'll actually have 2 curves here. Disruptive selection often ends up in speciation, where you end up if we're selecting for the 2 extremes. Stabilizing selection, that's where we select only for the mean. Well, the mean height for human beings worldwide is about 5'9", 5'10". Okay, that's the mean height for human beings. So if we were to only allow those organisms that are between 5'9" and 5'11" to reproduce, then that's going to make this curve skinny. We're going to have far less out on the far extremes. There still will be far extremes, but it's going to put most of our data will be straight up and down in the middle of this curve. And so you'll have this will be a tall, skinny curve. if we did that. That's called stabilizing selection. So let's take a look at what might cause each of these and what are some examples. Okay, take a look. Directional selection. Here we have a lizard with a shorter tail, and here we have a lizard with a longer tail. If, for instance, the long tails are selected over the shorter tails, then this whole bell curve is going to shift to the right. Okay, the whole bell curve is going to shift to the right. And so the average length will end up being much longer. Okay, and so you end up with more lizards with longer tails. Stabilizing selection selects for the medium, such that very short tails may not be selected for and very long tails might not be selected for, because that creates a problem. And those with medium-sized tails are the ones that have an advantage. Well, so what that's going to do is that's going to cause this whole curve to go upwards in the middle. So you'll have more medium-sized tails and less of the extremes. Well, disruptive selection is when the two extremes are selected for and nothing in the middle. So what you could end up with are, say for instance, a squirrel with very, very short tails and squirrels with very, very long tails. But medium-sized tails don't offer any sort of an advantage, and so you don't end up with a lot of squirrels with medium-sized tails. So that would be directional, stabilizing, and disruptive selection. So besides having an advantage as a result of either running or protection or whatever, what could cause the selection here? Well, let's back up one and take a look at something called sexual selection. Most characteristics in living organisms are caused by something called sexual selection, and females are typically the ones who make this decision within organisms. A lot of organisms' characteristics, like for instance the mane of a lion, the reason that male lions have manes is because female lions prefer males with a certain color mane. And so if more females prefer males with a darker mane, say for instance, then you're going to end up with more male lions with darker manes, because those with darker manes are the ones who get to reproduce. A lot of the mating activity in birds or fish or any organism, really, a lot of those mating rituals, or the mating behaviors, are sexually selected for. Antlers in deer, the colors in certain spiders, the tail of a peacock. Peahens prefer male peacocks with brightly colored feathered tail feathers. Fiddler crabs, female fiddler crabs prefer males with a huge claw, with one huge claw, and so that's a trait that is selected for as a result of sexual selection. So what are some of the natural selective pressures? Type of food. Okay, the type of food that's available. Those organisms that have the ability to utilize that type of food better are going to be the ones who put their genes in the next generation. Climate. Those organisms that are better suited for a particular climate are going to be the ones who live longer and put their genes in the next generation. Access to mates. Presence of competition. Okay, those that are better at accessing mates are going to be the ones who put their genes in the next generation. So whatever characteristic gives an organism an advantage in any of these categories is going to be causing that organism to live longer, put more genes in the next generation, and so the next generation will have more of whatever that particular trait was. That's natural selection. Okay. So what about artificial selection? If that's natural selection, there is something called artificial selection. And we've been doing artificial selection as long as we have been domesticating animals. Humans do a lot to affect the genetic diversity of animals. Think about all of the different types of dog. Every dog is the same exact species. It's amazing how many different shapes and sizes of dog you can get with a little bit of selective breeding and some wolf genes, because that's what we've done. Take a look. Chickens. Okay, you can see the typical size of chickens. We have been breeding food, chickens to eat for quite some time, and people tend to prefer breast meat from chicken more often, and so we've been breeding chickens to have larger breast muscles, and so that gives us these larger chickens. A wolf gave rise to every form of dog, whether we're talking about a Dachshund, a Poodle, or a Great Dane. They all have the same wolf genes. It's just some selective breeding that get these different shapes and different sizes. They're all the same species. And see, here are all of these dogs right here. I breed snakes. All of these ball pythons, none of them you would find necessarily in the wild because most of them would stick out, and so that would not be a trait that is advantageous in the wild, but in captivity and in the market, these traits are advantageous because people like them. Every snake that you see in this image right here is the same species. They're all ball pythons. And so what makes a difference is the way that different genes have been put together to give them these different morphs. It's just like skin color in a human. The difference, it just shows up more on the snakes because of the patterning in their scales. But these are forms of artificial selection. So gray wolf is a common ancestor for every type of dog. So it's amazing what happens when you take a little domestication and selective breeding, and you can get all these different types of dogs from a wolf. But you didn't know that broccoli was a result of selective breeding. And then you've got Brussels sprouts and also cabbage. So that's artificial selection. So let's think about evolution moving in particular ways. We have convergent and divergent evolution. Convergent evolution is when unrelated organisms have a similar phenotype because of similar selective pressures. For instance, fish, like a trout, and a dolphin, which is a mammal, have a similar body shape. Why? Because they live in similar selective pressures. They live in the water, and that particular torpedo body shape is advantageous for things that live in the water. So convergent evolution is not becoming one organism, but when two completely unrelated organisms have a similar body style. They have a similar phenotype as a result of common selective pressures. Divergent evolution, on the other hand, is when you have one population and part of the population experiences one set of selective pressures and part of the population experiences other selective pressures, and so this one population diverges. Now, this is a situation where one species becomes multiple species. That's divergent evolution. Think to what we just saw a few minutes ago with disruptive selection. So when you have disruptive selection, that leads to divergent evolution, which leads to multiple species or speciation. Here's some examples. Convergent evolution, similar body styles. Here's a shark, here's an ichthyosaur, which is an extinct reptile, and here's a dolphin. So we have a fish, a reptile, and a mammal, all with very similar body shapes because of the fact that they live in similar selective pressures. Flying squirrels and sugar gliders. These have very similar body shapes even though they're not related. One is a marsupial, sugar gliders are marsupials, whereas North American flying squirrels are rodents, and so you end up with similar body style because they have similar selective pressures. Now, here we have an example actually of both. This is convergent evolution because of the fact that wings, a wing, in order to perform that particular trait, that particular event, flying, has to have a particular shape. So in that sense, it's convergent evolution. But divergent evolution, if we take a look at the fact that the structure that is in a bat's wing and the structure that's in a bird's wing are very, very different. But the fact that they all have this typical wing shape, that is convergent evolution. Divergent evolution, like I said, is when you have one species that is exposed to multiple selective pressures, and so you end up with multiple species. Human beings clearly share an ancestor with all other primates because we're all primates. And so you can see here what's going on with, we actually diverged from each one of these different groups of primates. And over here you have multiple forms of elephant. Of course, today we only have Asian elephants and African elephants, but there have been multiple species of elephants all having a common ancestor. How is it that we know that evolution happens? We have evidence from all of these different areas that support evolutionary history, evolutionary theory, from paleontology, from transitional species, studying the anatomy and physiology of organisms, homology and analogy, vestigial structures. Vestigial structures, this is kind of cool because these are structures that no longer have a purpose. For instance, like our wisdom teeth or our appendix. Atavisms, this is when we end up with seeing genes that are present in an organism but are normally not expressed, and it gets expressed. We are primates. We have the genes for a tail. Every so often, a human is born with a tail. I mean, obviously, they surgically remove it not long after birth, but they're born with a tail because we do carry the genes for a tail. And that's called an atavism. Looking at the gene structure of organisms, the amino acid sequences. Now, amino acids, that would be proteins. Looking at observed natural selection of organisms and introduced species. So when we start taking a look at the way that things behave when we introduce a new species, we can see how natural selection works there. Embryology, that is looking at embryological development, looking at drug resistance and pesticide resistance, and then biogeography. So all of these different areas lead right into evolutionary theory and give us the evidence that we need to say that evolution is happening. We see it, we understand it, we know that it's taking place. Now, when we talk about the concept of a species, and in the most recent one of the most recent videos we looked at, we did talk about multiple types of species. The species being at the bottom of the classification list. Well, the concept of a species is a little fuzzy. And I put this here because I want you to see that, really species, the whole idea of species is a little fuzzy because organisms don't know what they are necessarily, or they don't know at all what they are. But if we take a look at this color wheel, here's red, and we can put our finger on it and say, okay, yeah, that's red. And here's yellow. But can you put your finger on this color wheel where red stops being red and starts being yellow? This is kind of the way that species are. The difference between species is a little fuzzy. And so we have to think about how we define species, because sometimes people will define a species as only being those things that can come together and mate and produce viable offspring. Well, that's not necessarily true all the time. And so we have to think about what necessarily makes a species. So I just want you to know that species is a little fuzzy. How do we determine the age of fossils? How do geology and geography factor into evolution? Typically, when we're looking at a fossil, we can determine its age through through looking at carbon dating, radioactive dating of some sort, looking at the differences between different radioisotopes, and we can determine the age of fossils. And by taking a look at where a fossil is in the strata of when we're looking at rock layers. Here are some misconceptions of evolution. Evolution is just a theory. Yes, evolution is a theory, but recall what we talked about with the nature of science and what makes something a theory and what makes something a hypothesis and so on and so forth. In order for a scientist to call something a theory, that means that you've got all of this evidence supporting it and nothing has been found that doesn't support it yet. And that's what Yes, evolution is a theory, but never use just a theory, because what that means is that you don't understand what a theory is and that you don't understand what science is. Um, Individuals evolve. Individuals do not evolve. That is a misconception. Never was there a fish that said, "Oh, I'm going to grow some legs." Nope, misconception. Individuals don't evolve at all. Populations evolve. Populations change depending on the environment. Evolution explains the origins of life. Okay, or organisms evolve on purpose. Nope, organisms do not evolve on purpose. There have been some, if we look through our evolutionary history, we see case after case after case after case where an organism evolved in what you can see afterwards as being a completely wrong direction. But what's, the right or wrong direction, you can't say at the time. It all depends on the way the selective pressures are working for that organism, that population of organisms at that time. Evolution does not explain the origins of life. That's something entirely different. The origins of life we look at some point in time. Chemistry did become biology, but that looking at that once we have life, that's when evolution takes over. Modern humans evolved from modern apes. Also a misconception. I think every time I hear someone say something like, well, if humans evolved from apes, why do we still have apes? No, you idiot. Dun, 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 slap, slap, slap. That's not the way that works. Okay, modern humans and modern apes evolved from a common ancestor. Okay, we are cousins. You got to look at it that way. We were cousins. Um, if you think you and your cousin didn't evolve from your cousins, both you and your cousins came from your grandparents. That's what it's more like. Okay, so humans and modern apes can't have a grandparent. Okay, not one from the other. So with that, we will bring natural selection to a close, and that ends this particular section, which is natural selection part 2.